good morning for those of you in Europe, and good evening, I guess, for our guests today or tonight in Australia. My name is Marius Dragomir, and I'm the director of the Center for Media, Data and Society. And we have today discussion on a topic in which our center hasn't ventured much in recent years or ever, if at all. And this is the whole debate about artificial intelligence and its impact on climate, something that I'm sure many of you have thought about. I have thought about it, but it is a topic about which I have to be honest with you. I do not know much, but that will make this discussion even more interesting. And I hope there are more people like me in this debate, because we are having with us today Benedetta Brevini, who is a fellow with our center. Benedetta is a journalist, media activist, and now she's a associate professor of communication at the University of Sydney. She has an impressive experience as a journalist in many places, including Milan, New York, and London before. She did work for CNBC and RAI, and she published in a number of newspapers and magazines, including The Guardian, Index of Censorship, and The Conversation. I'm not going to tell you more about the topic, but it's really great to have Benedetta with us because she has studied this topic. She just told me 5 minutes ago that she has done that for a long time, and she also has published recently a book which is called "Is AI Good for the Planet?" And she is the best position to discuss with us these issues. And I'm very curious to see what she has to say. She will give us a presentation of her knowledge in the next 30-35 minutes. But as we always say, I hope you brought your own questions, and we can definitely jump in and ask her to clarify things or any questions. So for the next 30 minutes, Benedetta, the floor is yours, and then we'll spend another 30 minutes with questions and discussion. Thank you very much for being with us, Benedetta. You're welcome.
Thank you, Marius, for the great introduction, and thank you to the Center for hosting me this afternoon, tonight for us in Sydney. It's a great pleasure because COP26 is actually the most extraordinary climate conference that we're seeing, and probably the most important of the century, I would say. So I want to start by sharing my screen with you. Let's see if I'm able to. I think it's all fine. And I should say that as Marius has kindly introduced the talk, I've been working on these ideas around the environmental impact of technology for quite some time now. But it took me a few years to realize the way in which we could really connect communication policy, the materiality of technology, and the climate crisis. And I think that actually we should always remember that the reason why this is extremely important now is that we know by now in a very clear way, and all the scientists that connect also through COP26 have told us and reminded us that if we don't cut by 50% all our emissions by 2030, and this is one of the latest, and you can check the work of Michael Mann as one of the most important climate scientists around, we will not be able to meet the famous Paris Agreement pledges. So we will be beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is something that is considered to be incredibly dangerous, and is considered to be something for which we will have to adjust to the normality of constant weather events, constant floods, constant shake up to our ecosystem that will lead to migrations from the global south and from the tropics, for example, and to major problems of inequalities rising and so on. So I started thinking, why is it that actually in communication policy and also in communication scholarship, we are not really understanding the way in which or we're not looking too much into the way in which communication systems and the climate crisis are related and are connected to one another. So I think that what is really important and what really, obviously, the pandemic has brought to a very clear relevance and understanding is that we rely on technology as never before. And actually, like I have this great slide from one of my classes during the year, and I think that we got used to see these slides and to see this classroom environment. We rely on communication systems, and we never could predict it before. And in fact, a very recent research that has been done by Make Around in the UK has showed us that video conferencing has even surpassed emails in business communication at the moment. This is really quite unprecedented. So I started really thinking, okay, we know that there is a climate crisis and we know that we need to act fast. And so why is it, and what does it all mean for us? That are scholars in communication policy, are scholars in communication systems, and are trying to understand if there is a connection. And also, what is really fascinating, and it's something that the COVID pandemic has brought to a great alarm, is that what COP26 has discussed a few days ago is the fact that carbon emission did not actually diminish very much during the pandemic. And in fact, they bounced back quite quickly. So I started thinking, okay, why is that? Why is it that during the pandemic, the carbon emission only decreased by between around 7%, according to the latest UN data? And so I thought maybe we should really start thinking about our reliance on communication systems, and maybe starting thinking of the reliance on our energy supply that is connected to our communication systems. And in fact, the world economy, as soon as the world economy started to recover, we see a big jump in the carbon emission. So while transportation activity came to an halt, what we were doing at home in this context, we were keeping teaching, we were keeping our business going, but we were keeping using the electricity grid, and the emissions didn't fall. So I think that this is really the starting point that should start making us questioning what's really going on, and what is this relation now then between the tech system and the climate emergency that is real. Because again, if we don't intervene in the next 10 years, we are on a trajectory to even 3. This is what most scientists are predicting. So I think that actually we should also remember that overall, the recent World Energy Outlook has already shown that the energy mix on which our electricity supply is based is completely funded 64% on fossil fuels, 64%. That means about 38 about coal, 23 on gas, and oil at about 3%. And again, what is the biggest cause of carbon emission? Fossil fuels. So by using extreme quantities of our tech and communication systems, we are, of course, using and consuming and producing carbon emission. So this is the starting point, really, for the conversation, and the starting point for my incredible interest, right, in this topic, and thinking of connecting communication systems with the climate emergency. So it's an interest that started back already around 2014 with one of the first workshops that we held with Graham Murdoch about understanding carbon capitalism and communication systems and their relationship. And of course, also from my discipline perspective, political economy, we realized that we needed to focus more on the materiality of technology. Because if we look at communication systems as machines and infrastructures that deplete scarce resources in their production, in their consumption and disposal of resources, of course, that is linked to the climate crisis. And of course, then we can better understand what it means to impact on the climate crisis and what we can do about it. And of course, the interesting thing is also that I already said, how relevant the carbon footprint of the tech industry is. But what you perhaps don't know is actually the footprint is forecasted to increase to 14% of the total emission. I mean, 40% is huge when we think that at the moment, the entire transportation industry that is always considered to be the biggest cause of the climate crisis is actually amounting to 3% of it. So again, data that should really make us think as communication policymakers, but also as communication scholars. So like, with this in mind,
can I ask you here very briefly to just clarify for us that the tech industry carbon footprint, this growth is generated by what exactly?
Of course. So like the biggest within the 14%, that is forecasted, to see increasing, because at the moment it's estimated that it's around 7 and 8% of the global carbon footprint. Of course, we have to consider that at the basis of the tech industry is the cloud and are the data centers. So the data centers eat up almost 45% of this total footprint, okay? And of course, then, you have to consider all the network infrastructures that, of course, are also incredibly consuming, right? And consuming energy. And that normally amounts to something like 24% of this entirety of the global carbon footprint. But on top of this, then you need to consider the power that is used to run our applications. And this, of course, has an incredible bearing because it means, for example, that if you use a very high quality video, for example, and you're watching the video on mobile, because of the servers that get activated on mobile as well, and the infrastructures that are necessary, your carbon footprint will increase already. So as you can see, the crucial thing about understanding communication systems is really to try to break down every single component of the production chain of communication systems, because I only listed the first bit, right, about the production of our communication systems. But then you have the phase of the distribution, the devices, for example, your mobile, and then you have the disposal. What happens, for example, to your devices when we get rid of them? And what is the energy that gets, of course, consumed and for example, to transport these devices and actually also dispose of them, especially, and which is something that unfortunately happens in some of the poorest areas of the world, because data colonialism is still very relevant and is actually increasing the inequalities of the current organizational capitalism, because of course, like the biggest e-waste dump are in the colonies of the colonies. And so, for example, like Cambodia is now one of the biggest e-waste dump in the world, or Bangladesh, okay? And this is incredibly unfair because the same countries are also the ones that lack in infrastructures and cannot compete in this quest for more and more technology and more artificial intelligence, for example. So they're completely excluded. So if this is the starting point, of course, then I thought, well, like how then do we make sense of the fact that AI, artificial intelligence, is actually becoming like super pervasive in our discussions around communication and communication systems? It seems unavoidable to be discussing the impact of AI in our world, in our society, in our schools, in our education, on medicine. And then I thought, okay, but what is AI exactly? Like, can we understand it as the latest phase and development of communication systems? Can we understand AI in this way and maybe then link it to the environmental cost that it might have? And so, because my question really became, especially observing how much I was personally and the people around me reliant on communication systems, I really started asking then, what are the environmental costs and the damages that the current data-driven communication systems are creating? And so it's a question that, as you can see, is very often neglected. And I thought, well, we're going to test this question, and we need to ask this question in relation to artificial intelligence, precisely because now this is the technology that we're constantly sold. This is the technology that is becoming popular. We went through a phase where the internet was the tool that was going to democratize us, without any in a way doubts, right? And now we are doubting that the digital lords are bringing democracy. And certainly there are a lot of digital lords like Facebook that are under huge scrutiny at the moment. But at the same time, I would say that what is important is that we need to start with the definition. So we need to explain why artificial intelligence can be considered part of these communication systems in order to really understand the environmental cost and the damages that it could create or not. So I started thinking, okay, my first problem then is to define what I mean and to define and to really understand what is it? What is artificial intelligence? And so I started looking for definitions. And these definitions were all leading me to this definition, that is a machine that can mimic human cognitive function. And then I thought, okay, but this is not really helping in trying to understand the materiality. If anything, this is really obfuscating the materiality of this technology. A cognitive ability, like something that, like the ability to mimic us, something that will mimic and probably better human cognitive functions, okay? So I looked around and obviously I went through a revision of many policy papers from China to the US, with the translator in China, to the US, to the UK, to France, to Germany. And interestingly, I found a good definition coming out from the EU white paper on artificial intelligence, because I felt that this definition was closest, to a definition that could help us understand it really as a collection of technologies. And also what this definition also brought was within the components, right? So a collection of technologies that combine data, algorithms, and computing power. And also the acknowledgement that is data capitalism, profit-led data capitalism that is bringing to this huge uptake of AI. So I thought this is a very good starting point, trying to understand the materiality instead of really constantly calling it as this, ability to mimic the cognitive, incredible abilities of the human mind. And so I looked into developing my own framework. The design I focused on and owes a lot to the understanding by Vincent Mosco of the so-called digital sublime, and that you might have heard about, and also the next internet, where the crucial components of the next internet are the cloud, very important for AI, datification, and the Internet of Things. And so in this way, communication systems, including AI, are approached as assemblages of material devices and infrastructures. And here you have a good working definition that looks at the materiality of this technology and has a great advantage. And in my view, the best advantage is this. Normally, AI is sold to us as the magic wand that will save us. It will save us from chronic disease. It will sort out the problems of the economy. It will resolve all the problems with cybersecurity and also, any kind of pandemic possibly, and also address the climate crisis. And as you can see, this is a typical myth-making slogan that very often is behind technology policy, where we develop this sort of incredible myth that then we can never challenge in any possible way. And here I have a great quote by Vincent Mosco that, of course, was trying to remind us that this has always happened with technology. And the history of technologies always has this belief that what we said about an earlier technology, the latest one will fulfill something even better, some sort of a revolutionary promise. And to use Peter Carey's work, which I really like a lot, it has almost a religious sentiment, about technology carrying all this power alone. And this, of course, is fascinating, is almost fictional, but also has a great ability, which is the ability to get away and absolutely forget and obfuscate the materiality of the technologies that we should be focusing on instead. And we should be focusing on the materiality of technology, especially in communication policy debates, because at the moment, addressing the climate crisis is the emergency. We know that it's a decade. We have a decade. We don't have longer than that. And so what are we doing? Constantly referring to this as artificial, referring to technology as something that we can almost not touch, right? And it's very interesting because not only AI is artificial, it's very material instead. But it also relies on data centers that are highly, consuming a lot of energy. And data centers are called clouds. And the definition of the cloud is one of the most amazing success of the history of marketing of the last 40 years, because again, cloud are actually made of materials, are made of dust. They are probably one of the dustier places in the world, very noisy and dirty, right? So they couldn't be far away from something in the sky that is fluffy, that is almost unreachable and intangible. And that's the trick. So what we need to do is to stop, at least as communication policies, to stop actually thinking of AI as something that is not material and to reclaim the space of materiality. Because if we do so, we can understand the array of environmental problems that can be produced, but we can also understand maybe how to fix them. And if we never acknowledge the problem, then we can't really even imagine solutions. So I want to start by explaining, what is really the major argument of the book, which is to argue that AI impacts on the climate crisis in 4 different ways. So, firstly, it impacts on the climate crisis because of the incredible computational power that is used when we develop and train an algorithm. Now, this took me a while to try to nail down and understand, because when I saw the numbers that you see at the bottom of this table, this is a table that I organized and wrote on the basis of a fantastic study that has been done by the University of Massachusetts at Amherst College by Struble, Ganesh, and McCallum in 2019, in which they tried to measure the carbon footprints of a very common algorithm, a translation algorithm, like what you have, when you use Google Translate, okay? So they estimate the cost of training, and they concluded that with the specific kind of neural networks they were using, the specific kind of architecture they were using, the carbon footprint amounted to that number over there at the bottom, 284 tons of CO2. Now, when I saw 284, I thought, okay, tons, what does it actually mean? How can we compare? So the first thing was, okay, I need to understand this. And so it compares to the average consumption of the average American car in a year. But it also compares, as you can see here in the table, to 234 kilograms of CO2 that you produce when you travel between London to Rome, or the 1,000 kilograms that you produce when you travel between London and New York. But look at the production of an algorithm in terms of the energy that they need for the training. It's 284,000. So I think that I'm really stepping on something really important that we need to reflect upon. And this is the first of the components of AI that impacts on environment. The second one, and Marius, you asked me a question about it a bit, is that of course, artificial intelligence relies on data to work. And so this means, of course, that data centers use a huge amount of energy. And it's like I used to compare it with some smaller countries, and it's the numbers are really extraordinary. So if you're interested in all this comparison, you can maybe find them in the book. But what is really important is that I already explained the consumption of and their immense carbon footprint, but on top of this, they also use extraordinary amount of water to cool down the systems, which of course leads to even more consumption. So, I would say that on the sustainability of data centers, even the so-called digital lords have been quite active on it, trying to make data centers more sustainable. And even Greenpeace, in one of the most recent reports, has concluded that there is some improvement. But the problem is still the 64% reliance of the electricity grid on fossil fuels. So if Microsoft tells us, as it does, that they reach a negative carbon footprint, they do so because of, credits met, basically, with climate, right? But they also then would not tell you that despite their efforts to make the data centers more sustainable, they might be connected to a grid because they might not be completely reliant on solar power, and the grid might be in New Jersey or might be in Utah, where you have over 75% of fossil fuels, invested in the production of the electricity. So again, major problem here, the second way in which AI is impacting on the climate crisis. And I move to the third one, which is really scary because I think that actually the efforts of researchers should really investigate this problem. And it's again, the inequalities of colonialism and the violence, the slow violence of colonialism that is not only destroying the environment, but also the societies and the communities that are living in this major e-waste dump. And the cost also associated with the transports of these mineral, these sources, and the way in which these mineral sources that are needed, like lithium, for example, like to develop the devices that are then powered by AI, are again really, really intensive. And a clear global conversation in communication policy about this issue has to start. And if you are interested in that topic, Toby Miller and Richard Maxwell have been doing excellent work on this, especially following the production chain of iPhones from their Cupertino land to India or Bangladesh, and see where the devices that we're constantly using powered by AI are. And then the fourth component, something that I really could not imagine, especially because we know also because of European debates, but we also know because of Council of Europe debates, for example, that we are able as a society, as policymakers, to decide that AI-powered weapons cannot be developed. And this is something on which the European Union has been very vocal about. We are not letting AI directing weapons. But we see how incredible the greenwashing of the digital world, so the GAFA, right? So from Facebook to Amazon to Apple to Microsoft, how incredibly involved in this greenwashing they are. But behind the back, they're also incredibly involved in establishing the most powerful AI divisions with oil and gas companies. So that's a fourth way, in my view, in which the components and AI are impacting on the climate emergency. And a very interesting research done by Zion Market Research found that the sector is about to really reach, in just 5 years, something like $4 billion. I mean, this is again something that we cannot really afford, because the major objective of this type of extraction is to be more efficient with extracting fossil fuels, which is precisely against what we've been arguing, all the time, also during COP. And again, we should intervene in this. We should decide that this type of technology we shouldn't develop. And the idea that we can be more efficient in digging fossil fuels is simply unacceptable in times of climate emergency. So, what do we make of all of that?
Benedetta, let me just ask you here. First, just a clarification. So you are saying that the largest AI investment in overall, like per industry, is in oil and gas. Is that correct?
No, it's not the highest. No, it's not the highest, but it's, as you can see from the profit, it's really big. So it's growing in an unprecedented level. I mean, the highest applications actually of AI in China and in the US at the moment are, especially in services, including, for example, financial services, including marketing services, everything, for corporate, development and business, So that would be one of the major developments. Of course, there are other sectors that are very relevant in banking, in finance. They are growing really fast. Of course, then they are the best, the better application, but for example, the entire insurance sector is embracing AI. Then you have an incredible market in the education sector, an incredible market in everything that is done at the business level. So HR, for example, and of course, in the health sector, which is at the moment something that is highly discussed and debated from an ethical perspective.
Right.
So just to
thank you. This is great. Go ahead.
Yeah, but this is really worrisome because this is something that really escaped any kind of logic, and it's really something that we shouldn't allow, and we can just intervene as much as we intervene fast in saying we're not developing AI-driven applications for weapons. We're simply not doing it, and they should ban these too. There are simply certain kind of technologies that are really bad for humanity, so they're not helping in public interest. So, I just wanted to conclude, or we can move to the questions, but the conclusions, if you have the chance to read the book, is to try to look at the so what and what do we do about it. And in the book, I provide with a series of solutions, which are really around, the idea, what are the values that should guide AI development in communication policy if we want to address, the climate emergency. And I propose a sort of a policy toolkit that we could develop to address it. And of course, when it comes to structural reforms, you can't just address the issue with one simple, solution. There are a set of policies, but of course, this starts with, a serious intervention on the ownership of this, what I call the digital lords, right, that are winning the race of AI. And we need to know exactly who owns what. So the usual political economy questions around the ownership of communication systems become really crucial, because we see that there is already a monopoly developing in all the production of and the development of AI applications. But the second intervention, of course, should be towards more transparency of the carbon footprint of all these technologies. So, for example, if I'm buying my new smart desk for my university, I need to be able, as a citizen, to know what is the carbon footprint of the smart desk, because I need to know how much I'm consuming. And it's a right that we have as a citizen and also as a consumer to understand, for example, how much the algorithm that were used for the type of device were consuming, but also what are the costs for the devices, for the material sources that went into the device. And we can do that. And I call this a sort of a green tech certificate. And then, in my view, we need a very serious intervention on education policies. So we need to be able to develop green tech AI, and we need to intervene on this from elementary school to high school to universities to raise awareness, because citizens need to be aware of these issues. They need to know that if they decide to have a call with their mother on the other side of the planet on Skype, if they turn down the video, they're likely to save power. And but as individuals, we cannot change. We cannot do much about the climate crisis. We need a clear structural intervention that can only come from a global conversation and from global governance, in my view. Because it will not really make a major difference if we start only communicating on telephones and, without the video, without a radical intervention. And then, of course, I think that another very important intervention would be to regulate obsolescence. It's unacceptable that my device will stop working in 2 years. Who decides this? Why? We can, as a society, decide that we want these devices to be lasting for 15 years, for 20 years, for as long as possible. And we should demand the digital lords to stop making it obsolete immediately after 6 months by developing new software that will not run on these devices, because we know the climate consequences of this production. So we need, in a way, to address and regulate consumerism, but not from the, it's never the consumer that should be blamed. It's the producer that should be blamed. It's the digital lords that we should regulate, because otherwise we would embrace a very neoliberal agenda that blames everything on the consumers, right? Not even considering that we are citizens before consumers. These are just a few of the interventions. Of course, I'm discussing many more in the book at the end, because I spent quite some time trying to think about solutions. But I think we have a mandate here, also as communication scholars and communication policymakers, which is to start by trying changing the discourse and start using the right words. So, if we break down the common sense that tells us that artificial intelligence is something in the air, super intelligent, that we cannot really touch, well, it's the first step to start asking the right question about the materiality of technology. So I think that as scholars, as activists and communication activists, we need to start engaging with that. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'm very happy to answer your questions.
This is great, Benedetta. That was a fascinating presentation, and also I have to say, in some parts, quite scary, I would say. We have already, and I want to encourage people and our guests on both Zoom and Facebook to send questions. My colleagues will take these questions. And for those in Zoom, please raise your hand and you can even address the question directly to Benedetta. I have tons of questions, but let me just give the floor to some of the people who watch us. We have a question on Facebook from Hong Chi Nguyen. The question is the following: is AI inspired environmental movements and can be seen as an essential contribution to the global goal of environmental sustainability?
So
go ahead.
The discourse around the AI or AI per se, because actually we could argue that the effect of challenging AI and just starting a counter discourse, a counter activist discourse that looks at AI in this material way could be a good starting point. In fact, my favorite movements that are happening at the moment in this field are actually the movement of the tech workers that are working inside the biggest digital lords on both sides of the world, because the biggest developer and the biggest winners at the moment are China and the US. And you can see that the tech workers are very involved in environmental struggles and in raising awareness within the organization. And I think that actually they are the ones that we should be really monitoring and looking at. But most importantly, what would be crucial would be that us as communication policy and tech policymakers are starting bringing this debate in the environmental policy circles. Because believe me, it's not easy to get environmental policy people to listen. They switch off immediately and very often they will say technology is a great thing. I'll give you this example because it's extraordinary. In Australia at the moment, the prime minister, which is constantly at war with France because of leaks and lies and all of that, it's very entertaining to watch from an international relations perspective, has said that the climate policy that they're developing is as a slogan. And the slogan, the Australian way, is more technology and no taxes. So again, the idea is technology will save us and we're keeping digging fossil fuels and we're going to do nothing about the crisis. because we leave it to technology. So it's very important that we break down and we just challenge this discourse.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the environmental policy world has switched off, and why? What's the reason? What do you think is the reason?
It's really extraordinary, but I really feel that climate scientists are highly focused on, for example, the old style, mineral behemoth and mineral giants and mining giants, carbon producers, and they're really doing great work on that. At the same time, you have environmental organizations like Greenpeace, for example, being extremely focused on the finance, the banking sector. They want fossil fuels, they want to get rid of fossil fuels reliance and make sure that they can have commitments on and through this banking institution. And this is great work. This is what that we need. But I think, and I suspect, that the mythology around technology that we read constantly also in media, in mainstream media debates, has really kind of delayed a debate on an understanding of the environmental impact of technology. Because if technology is traditionally always supposed to save us and to make the world better, then why questioning that technology could instead create the climate crisis, right? So it's really, again, I think it's part of the mythology of technology that we don't have. We don't have the mythology of banking. We don't have the mythology of the insurance systems, right? The mythology of finance to the level we probably did in the 80s, but it's over. And so it's much more difficult to take a stand against the technology giants. But I think things can be changing now. So I'm hopeful.
Right. Thank you. Well, we have a question also from John Masuku. John is a fellow as well with our center. He lives in Zimbabwe, and of course he thanks you first for the presentation. And very briefly, he's wondering what are your key findings and recommendations for the world he lives in sub-Saharan Africa, where he says the West has plundered our natural resources, especially during colonialism to the present. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the findings are pretty dreadful because the thing is, when you look at the developments of AI, the really incredible, dramatic situation of the African subcontinent, for example, is really that there aren't enough infrastructures. Okay, so if you say that AI is going to save society and AI is the only big business opportunity of the future, which all our Western countries are telling us, and also China in the East, then it means that you're ruling out, completely the global South. So the global South again becomes the land that gets completely, violated again, because the resources will always we use them to produce the devices that then get consumed only in the West. And not only that, I mean, the reliance of businesses on AI is becoming extraordinary. And of course, the countries that don't have, for example, the data centers that consume so much energy, you don't have enough data centers in Africa, in the entirety of Africa at the moment. They're not there. The same can be said for South America. The infrastructures have not been developed. Of course, we know that China is catching up quite quickly, but the level of devastation also of the environment is extraordinary. So these are all the questions that we should really pose our policymakers when we are pushing AI in the way in which we are, because the reality is that we are really creating again data colonialism in another even more violent way.
Thank you. Well, before we receive more questions from the audience, both in Zoom and Facebook, I have a question about you. I think your recommendations and the areas for intervention are great, and you give us a lot of material to work there. And let me just refer. I have questions about all three areas you put forward. But talking about the ownership, you mentioned that it's crucial to study, if I understood well, the ownership of the, how you call them, digital lords, the digital companies. How exactly you see that being done, and who should do that, and to what purpose exactly?
Well, I mean, the problem is, as with everything, that when we are, especially, and you know this very well, but when we have in tech policy or in communication policy, digital lords that are becoming too powerful. And of course, the problem is the problem of corporate capture, right? So when you have these entities that are so powerful that nation states almost cannot regulate them anymore, because they are the ones on which very often we rely. And if you think also with the right to be forgotten, right? The fact that the European Union had to rely on Google somehow, because it was too much work, right? For a state like to trying to implement. So similarly, the problem is a problem of size. And what we are seeing also in the area of AI is that the usual monopolists are becoming the biggest players again. But very often they use different words. They use DeepMind, to use Google. They use Alexa to obfuscate, They use Meta, because Facebook wants to clean the brand. So again, the first step is really to try to understand the major ownership. Who are the biggest players in this market? And this is the question that we really need to ask and keep monitoring. So, perhaps the new Matrix project, Marius, should be really on trying to understand the ownership of the bigger, these big companies. In my book, actually, I showed that some of the biggest are all based in the US, a few of them in Europe, but then sadly they get acquired by the same digital lords. And of course, it's a competition between China and the US at the moment. So that's a starting point. But in terms of regulation, I think that the regulation should really start also first at the level of antitrust, because I think that at the level of antitrust, there is also some kind of global agreement. Right? I mean, I'm all in favor of fragmenting them, and also saying, okay, you have a division that only does AI applications of Google. We separate that completely and we ask them and we sell it to another competitor. So we recreate competition in the market, because this is actually the basis for any kind of liberal market intervention, right? We don't need to be social democratic to intervene like that. It's not an intervention that would require so much. But then, of course, we need to make sure that you have a fragmented set of competitors, because at the moment you don't. And if you don't, you can't really expect for a regulation that is in the public interest and for a regulation that will leave profits aside and actually look at the climate emergency and the public interest. It's not possible with monopolies.
Right. And going back to back to your recommendations, you spoke about transparency, which is extremely important. And first of all, I'm just trying to imagine that. And do you have in mind something like when you buy a product now today, for example, like appliances and so on, you always have this energy consumption in shops. Is that something that similar that you have in mind?
Absolutely, and we can do it.
That, yeah, go ahead.
I think it's really, I spoke to many engineers, people working in AI and in neural networks, and they're very hopeful that neural networks, which are the basis of the current development of AI, can become greener, okay? And so they're always talking about the fact greener means that they consume a little bit less of computational power, a little bit less, right? So, for them, it's extremely easy to decide and to measure the computational power and therefore the carbon emissions of, for example, the training, right? And then we should add to that also the cost, so the carbon emissions that are connected to usage of a device, and the average, to use the device. And then we should be able, and we can trace it back. It's really the production chain and distribution chain that we should follow, for the device. And then, of course, we add the cost to get rid of the device, to dispose of it. And
right.
And so the green tech certificate, in my view, should consider the combination of all of them. And in this way, we would be enabled into, a more climate green choice, right? And climate emergency, minded choice, if you want. And
right.
This is where I think that green tech literacy becomes extraordinarily important, because you can't just have an intervention in the direction of transparency if you don't have tech literacy, and if you don't explain what it really means to have this certificate and to have this label and to understand what's behind and what you're doing when you buy your next smart refrigerator, that you're very excited by, which is powered by Alexa, that will tell you that you need to buy more milk, otherwise you can't have your cappuccino in the morning. And then you'll decide, okay, is this something that I really need if I need something like 1,000 kilograms of carbon emissions tomorrow to produce it? Simple as that. I don't think it's so difficult.
No, it's not so difficult. And actually, I think you really nailed it here, because one issue is how to implement these transparency related ideas. And I think that's doable. And I don't see anybody actually opposing that. But the second aspect that you mentioned, which is the literacy and people's understanding of that, is, I think, more important. And of course, it's important to educate people on that, because even today, when you look at like simple appliances and the electricity consumption and so on, you see all those A, B, C, D and all that, but I'm not sure how people react to that, whether they maybe some of them make decisions based on that, but without actually understanding that the issue it's actually useless, I would think. With the electricity appliances, I think it's easier, because people will understand that if they buy an appliance that is not that consumes more, it will cost them more, essentially. So I think here the issue is how to actually explain the consequences that AI can have on their lives, which is more difficult than just the electricity related issues. But talking about that, do you think this in this area of transparency, this should come also with some limits on such products? Just to give you an example, is it just to label and to add this information, or do you think it would be also important to, for example, limit or ban certain products, AI related technologies that consume too much? Is that also something that you had in mind, or not at all?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because actually I'm someone that is still enthused by technology, and someone that is very curious about the way in which technology could be used for the public interest, and so I don't think that we should be scared completely, but I think that we should be given the choice, and a choice that is a real one, right? So transparency programs, I think they could be enforced at the level of global governance. And I think that, COP26 could have the mandate for that, because all states are there and they could really intervene in that. And at the same time, we combine them with tech literacy. But I think that like having just, for example, a label, like, and should actually give the opportunity to also, for example, reward the companies that are actually doing so much, right? So I think there should be a sort of also global rewards also for the industries that are really highly involved, but not greenwashing, really highly involved in deciding that certain products should not be produced, because they're in no way they're contributing to the public interest. The problem here, Marius, is that unfortunately, many people that are involved in AI policy debates and in the developments, have ties with the industry. And of course, because AI is a big business, it's led to profit making. It's like the data capitalism that is powering AI is the issue at the very basics, right? So we should really intervene there, because actually we know that if Facebook developed in the 50s, we wouldn't have Facebook the way it is today. We would have had something more similar to the BBC, or to ABC in Australia, or to ZDF in Germany, or to France Television, something that is actually more public facing, right? Something more like also managed in the interests of the public. But we don't, because we let business, unregulated business, develop this technology. And this is happening again. And this is where the debate on AI policy developments is now being completely focused on narrow ethical debates. Mm-hmm. And in ethical debates, there is no space for the materiality of technology and for the climate crisis. So this is really the biggest issue. And so if we actually say, okay, the ethical framework is not enough, then we can reappropriate and we can say, okay, the ethical framework is not enough. We need to do more. And so we decided we are banning certain developments because they're not in the public interest. But insofar as we don't, change, the way and the global interests that are behind this development, it's hard actually to change the direction, the trajectory.
Right. Well, and a question about regulation, you touched on that briefly, but again, I'm trying to imagine how this will be done. I think at local level, national levels, in some areas, especially like when it comes to ownership rules or transparency related rules, I think I can imagine that. But how do you think they should be tackled, this regulatory aspect? You mentioned the global versus national level. Have you had any?
Yeah, because I've been thinking quite a lot about this, and I think that if you look at AI developments, it's led at the national level, for example. So every nation has their own strategy, and this is very similar to climate policies in a way, which are really nation-led. Okay, but what happens is that then you have global governance fora, like COP26. We had a very similar with the World Forum of the Information Society, right? Very similar, where you can have pledges and you can agree on the framework. So I see certainly a concerted, set of pledges that come at the national level, but they need to achieve and to lead to a similar result, just like with climate pledges, okay? But of course, they have to be more realistic. They have to be bending us, because if they're not bending decisions, then you know that they're not going to be taken into consideration. So we need something stronger than the Paris pledges, for example, at the moment. So I often think of the way in which the Council of Europe is structured, for example, and the way in which they're issuing, their declarations. They're actually very relevant, but they don't have the regulatory efficacy that, a regulation coming from the European Union would have on the states. But there are certain ways actually to use also international law to intervene in this. And I think we should use them because we don't really have the time. We can't afford. I had a fantastic, a very interesting engineer the other night as I was discussing the book, and he was asking, but we are doing so much as engineers to decrease the carbon emissions of the data centers. I said, we only have 9 years now. Can you achieve that? 0 emissions in 9 years? I said, you can't. So you need us to find another solution. And the other solution can be we ban certain applications, we change the direction of AI developments, we try to use it only for the good, but it has to be for the good of the climate, not just for the good of the digital lords.
Right. Thank you. Well, we are close to the end of the discussion, but let me just ask you that because you have gathered a lot of knowledge. You discuss a lot of things in the area of solutions and recommendations. I know this is maybe a crazy question, but I will ask it. What do you think it will happen of all the things that you put forward, all the things that are being discussed in various parts of the policy circles? What do you think it will happen? How much of the things that you recommended you think will be achieved in the next 5 years?
In the next 5 years, well, I think, for example, the huge programs, and I've been discussing this with some colleagues at UNESCO, for example, huge programs in green tech literacy can happen. So this is something where we can really invest immediately. The other thing that I think is very probable would be to try to really push for a green tech label, so trying to have because that is, of course, more like, can I say it, more neoliberal perhaps as a policy, so it's easy to implement. Where we will struggle, as we always struggle in communication policy or in media policy, is a series of regulation, for example, to avoid concentration of power. So that is where we will struggle. And I have been incredibly happy to see the European Union taking on the digital giants constantly, especially on antitrust. At the same time, I don't think that anything like that will ever happen in the US. And I think that despite the incredible disregard and spite for Facebook at the moment, I think that probably the best thing that can come from the US would be a regulation to protect children's safety. But I'm not expecting major intervention in infrastructures there. So I think that the other two policies that I mentioned are the most likely. But I think that what can happen in the next 5 years is that we start creating the fora to bring communication policy people and environmental policy people together to have a conversation together, because at the moment it's not happening, and it should be happening because we have a lot to say and they have a lot to answer for as well. So I think that this is our, very big and very, I would say, urgent challenge in the next 3 years. So we can start also at the Central University.
Yes, that's great. Thank you very much, Benedetta. This was definitely for me. This was the greatest learning experience I had in a long time. There are several things and several topics that are extremely important also for us as researchers, and your ideas were extremely welcome here. We'll definitely look into these ownership-related issues in the coming years. But again, this was great. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm sure the people who watched us appreciated as well your knowledge and the expertise that you are bringing to the field. And well, this is just the beginning, I think. As I said, our center hasn't ventured much into this topic, but thanks to you, I think we see a lot of areas we want to cover in the future. So this is just the beginning. We'll follow up with more things like this, more programs and more research and more studies. Thank you very much, and good luck with your great work, Benedetta.
Okay, thank you, Marius, and thank you for having me. Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.